Mental health therapy has come a long way in the past few decades, but it hasn't always been easily accessible to all populations. One group that has been particularly underserved is the African American community. In this brief overview, we'll explore the history of African Americans and mental health therapy, including some of the factors that have contributed to the disparities that still exist today. The history of African Americans and mental health therapy can be traced back to the early days of psychiatry, when many practitioners believed that people of African descent were inherently inferior and more prone to mental illness. This belief was rooted in racist and colonialist ideology, and it had a lasting impact on the treatment of African Americans for many years to come. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, African Americans who sought treatment for mental illness were often subjected to inhumane conditions, including being placed in segregated mental hospitals and subjected to brutal and degrading treatments. Additionally, many African Americans were simply not given access to mental health services at all, due to factors such as poverty, lack of education, and discrimination. The civil rights movement of the 1960s brought about some changes in this area, as African Americans began to demand equal access to mental health services. However, progress was slow, and many African Americans continued to face significant barriers to getting the help they needed. One of the key factors contributing to the disparities in mental health care for African Americans has been a lack of cultural competence among mental health professionals. Studies have shown that African Americans are more likely to seek out mental health services when the therapist is African American, and that they are more likely to drop out of treatment when the therapist is not culturally competent. Another factor is the stigma that still exists around mental illness in many African American communities. Due to the history of mistreatment and discrimination, many African Americans are hesitant to seek out mental health services and may feel that doing so is a sign of weakness or a lack of faith. Despite these challenges, there has been some progress in recent years in improving access to mental health services for African Americans.